Good morning. Hi. Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I expect a few late arrivals because that parking lot is full. Yay, indeed. I'm so glad to see all of you. The weather is wonderful, and I thought this would be a great way to kick off our spring season opening. Many of you joined us this past weekend for Meet Me Outdoors, and one of the spaces that would have opened to the public would be Tower Grove House. For those of you who haven't been there in a little while, hopefully I'm going to share some stuff today that's going to pique your interest, both to guide our visitors there as well as bring you to a new part of the history of the garden that you may not know as much about. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Haley O'Toole. I am the Historical Interpretation Specialist here at the garden. My primary work is the curator of Tower Grove House, so I take care of the collection there. I create the engaging exhibits that our visitors learn the majority of our history from, and as a part of the interpretation department, I contribute to signage and the greater visitor experience at large. Today we're going to be talking about the newest exhibit in Tower Grove House, the Life at Home exhibit, the Trealease family at Tower Grove House. This is a new narrative for many of our visitors as well as our volunteers. So I hope this is going to give you an opportunity to learn the next chapter of our garden's history. So I know many of you interact with Tower Grove House in a variety of ways. Traditionally, I am sure that you are familiar with sharing with visitors that Tower Grove House is the home of our founder, Henry Shaw. Built in 1849, that this home has served as his country residence as he built the garden that we enjoy today. A proverbial bachelor. There were 2 bedrooms in the west wing with a formal parlor and a dining room, and an informal dining room to take his everyday meals. Shaw would have lived through a very transitional time in St. Louis, seeing it go from a few city blocks to a booming city with immigration expanding population and technology turning our community into this hub of industry. The photo you're seeing here is what Tower Grove House would have originally looked like. Henry Shaw would have lived here on the west wing of the house, which we currently interpret as his part of the home. Originally, the east wing would have been the servants' quarters, which would have been dormitory style, that would have helped house the people that would have served both the house and the garden grounds, cooking, cleaning, and the like. It is most impactful to many of our visitors as they learn how the garden grew around the space to learn that Tower Grove House is really the centerpiece of the garden. This is really where our garden began, which you'll hear many of our volunteers and staff say as they work inside Tower Grove House. Built in 1849, it was built 10 years before the garden opened to the public. We share in our parlor Mr. Shaw's drawings and a place where he would have worked to create a lot of what you see today. And while Henry Shaw's story is very interesting, we now have the opportunity to share the next chapter of this interesting tale. Excuse me. The newly renovated space on the eastern part of the house, you'll hear me refer to it as the East Wing, is a story that is something I find a bit more relatable to a lot of our visitors. It shares the trials and tribulations of family life in the garden in 1900. Dr. Trealease would have lived there with his wife, Julia, and Tower Grove House would have been their home. It would have been the primary place they would have raised their children. It would have been the place that Dr. Trealease would have done the most of his life's scientific exploratory work, and would have been a place where they would have grown together over the course of about 30 years. This exhibit space will rotate yearly. So this year, our visitors are receiving an introduction to who Dr. Trealease is. Many of our visitors, volunteers or staff, are less familiar with the story of the Trealease family. And so what you'll see this year is essentially getting to know who the Trealeases are. And today I will be sharing the narrative of the exhibit, discussing some of the important details that we find are connecting to our visitors in a very personal way. I'll also be talking a bit about the renovation work that was done, because we are getting a lot of questions, because obviously our visitors are seeing something that's new. And then we're gonna hopefully, if you all have time, based on what your meeting schedules are, take a little walk out to Tower Grove House in this beautiful weather to take a private tour. If you are available, we'll be able to go to the space, ask questions, and talk through some of the things that we're sharing here today. Does that sound like a good plan? Yes. So I'm hopefully going to get through the next 10 slides in about 20 minutes. So put the timer on. This exhibit, as I said, shares a lot about family life in the 20th century. It shares the Trealease family both living and working on garden grounds. The Trealease family would be Dr. William Trealease, who you see pictured here, his wife Julia, their 5 children, and the time that they lived at Tower Grove House, which would be from 1889 to 1912. The Trealease family would witness a really revolutionary time in American history. So a lot of what we share in the section about family life has to do with what children would have been doing at the turn of the century, women's roles both in the home and in the workplace, as well as some of the scientific achievements that Dr. Trealease would have been discovering as he lived within the house. As many of you may know, Dr. Trealease was the first trained botanist to head the garden, which means a lot of his work happened within those walls and is still extremely impactful to a lot of the work that we do today. We'll talk more about that as we carry on. We also share quite a bit about the architecture of Tower Grove House. And how it changed. Many of our visitors see pretty clearly that there's a difference between the eastern part of the house to the western part of the house. And so we're now able to share more about what Italianate architecture is and how some of those things changed as the house was rebuilt by a different architect beyond our favorite St. Louis architect, George Barnett. So, as I mentioned, excuse me, this cough season has been something else. We share quite a bit about how the house changed. So we have many wonderful images from our illustrated history that share how Tower Grove House was completely removed on the eastern side. In 1889, as many of you may know, Henry Shaw passed. He would have known Dr. Trealease as he was already the head of the botany department, newly established at Washington University. I've shared with many guests that Dr. Trealease came in a very Willy Wonka-like way, in that Henry Shaw got to know Dr. Trealease as he became the professor there, and then decided that he would become the director of the garden after his passing. Unfortunately, the home had never really been updated beyond that informal dining room that was an addition. So the home was essentially a bachelor pad. The eastern part of the house, as I mentioned, was a servant's quarters. It was completely divided from the western part of the house. And so because of the needs of a growing family, the Board of Trustees decided that they would completely demolish the east wing and rebuild it in the year 1890. The rebuild happened in almost one complete year. It's amazing to see the photos, but that's what cheap labor at the turn of the century can do. A quick turnaround in demolishing early in the year, and by the end of 1890, there would have been a completely rebuilt east wing. Sanitation needs were also a huge consideration in the rebuilding of this. We talk a lot about the technological changes that one will see in the east wing of the house. Many of our visitors love that interior bathroom, and that was very, very much needed. The outhouse, as many of you might know, was built too close to Tower Grove House, which is why Henry Shaw built that informal dining room. But that sanitation issue continued to be a problem as the Trealease family moved in. It became abundantly clear that they needed to find an ulterior solution. And so building a bathroom was one of the primary reasons for rebuilding that east wing of the house. They chose an architect, Joseph Given, who was well-versed in plumbing, which is not the first thing you think about when you think of an architect, but because he had so much experience with plumbing, he became the first choice to ensure that this structure would have running water. There's quite a bit of great information that a lot of our visitors are really connecting with about the bathroom and the history of the bathroom. The signage on the wall helps them learn more about the invention of indoor plumbing. Many people take that for granted. It's a very relatable thing because so many people don't realize how long it took for us to figure out the best ways to have a toilet indoors or a tub, and how that improved sanitation in a very dramatic way. That technology we talk about quite a bit, as well as the cost of creating this new addition. The sewer pipe that would have been installed would have cost the garden about $1,200, which in today's money doesn't sound like a lot, but at that time would have been quite an investment. But they knew that there was no alternative, and per Henry Shaw's will, the director must live on garden grounds. And so they honored that immediately by making this renovation. As I mentioned, there's a variety of wonderful photos that show the construction that you'll see both in the signage and in interpretive cards at the house. We also have a set of historic cards for docents who give tours located in the volunteer cabinet. I always like to plug those because you can take those out with you on tours if you're giving a historic tour or you think your audience might be especially interested in seeing some of those images on how the garden has changed over time. Dr. William Trealease is a very interesting character. As I've gotten to know him over the last year, I'm becoming more appreciative of the way that he came to love botany and all things plant. In a very different, he has a very different story than a lot of professionals of his time. He was born in Mount Vernon, New York in 1857. Which would have been 2 years before the garden opened to the public. He was the son of a pattern cutter in metalworking, so a trade, and in that tradition, he would have learned the trade of his father. The expectation would have been that he would have carried on that trade. But by all accounts, he understands the importance of the trade, but continues to go outside. He becomes quite interested in hunting and fishing, and through that process comes to learn the interesting parts of nature. So he was known as a collector in that he would go out on these hunting trips and would gather things, seeds, leaves, nuts, acorns, all of the things we talk about in the collection of curiosity type programs that we offer here. And then he would have, through that exploration of the outdoors, become interested in botany. It would eventually become his main focus of study when he goes to college at Cornell in 1877, and then he would eventually move on to Harvard. Harvard would be the place where he would meet the most life-changing person. You often meet people throughout your life that you don't quite know how they will impact you in the future. But there he worked under Asa Gray, who many of you know was a friend and colleague professionally to Henry Shaw. Asa Gray would eventually be someone who would refer Dr. Trealease for a job at Washington University to become the Engelman Professor of the School of Botany. Dr. Trealease has an interesting background prior to coming to the garden. At that time, if you studied botany, you were generally a professor. That was a pretty average line of work, but he would have studied destructive insects and cotton. He would have worked for the United States Department of Agriculture. He would have done a lot of study in parasitic fungi and other things of that nature. So he had a very broad interest base. After he was appointed here, to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, he would slowly learn more about the variety of botanical study that is possible. He would have been a professor and eventually would have been more or less the head of that program. It's there he would have met a student named Julia Johnson, who would eventually become his wife. And soon after, he would get the job at Washington University that would bring him to St. Louis. As I mentioned, Henry Shaw would become acquainted with him and soon find ways to honor his legacy by passing it to Dr. Trealease. He would have known him directly and accepted that he was the next person to carry on his legacy. A lot of the text in the house also shares what life of women would have been like. As I mentioned, that wife of his, Julia, she would have been one of the most interesting characters that I'm learning more about and enjoying the most out of this entire process. And so we share quite a bit about women at the turn of the century, things that they would have been doing, the removal of gender roles, and that many women were still staying home in the traditional fashion, but many more were starting to attend college and become a part of the working world. We share that because of our friend Julia. Julia would have attended the University of Wisconsin, as I mentioned. She would have a Bachelor's of Letters degree, which is today the equivalent of a Bachelor's of Arts degree. She would have studied the classics as well as hard sciences, botany, chemistry, things of the like. But there she would meet Dr. Trealease and choose the path of wife and mother eventually she would bore them 6 children, of which 4 would survive. This is a photo of her with baby Frank, their eldest, somewhere downtown in St. Louis before they moved into the garden. I love this photo because he's just so cute. He's so happy. But she would eventually come to name herself in her alumni records as an assistant to the garden. The garden has no record of exactly what that would be because, unfortunately, history likes to leave out women's contributions. But as her saying that, I can only imagine what her other duties as assigned would be beyond caring for their children and keeping Tower Grove House as the center of the garden and a place to host people. We also share quite a bit about the children and what children's lives would be like around 1900. We share quite a bit about going to school, and as school became more formalized at that time, we share quite a bit about the Trealease boys. There would be 4 who would grow up in Tower Grove House. This is Frank. He was that baby we saw in that photo before. He would grow up at Tower Grove House almost the entirety of his life. This is actually the back corner. This is the back porch that faces the herb garden. This would be where the angel fountain stands today. I love this dog because we don't have a record anywhere else of a garden dog, but clearly they had a puppy. But these children would have found life here in the garden a bit different than life out in the world. We have one wonderful oral history that shares a bit about what children would have been doing on garden grounds, which I have resources for that I can share with you. And a lot of that is shared in the exhibit at hand. We also share quite a bit about the scientific exploration that Dr. Trealease would do while he was tenured here at the garden. We're very fortunate to know quite a bit about 2 major expeditions that he would have attended. First, the Harriman expedition, which is still known as the base for Alaskan conservation. This was a multiple-month journey where they would have boated around the coast with biologists, botanists, photographers, people detailing life and culture in the Alaskan tundra, almost completely untouched. This is where people go to identify what untouched Alaska looks like. And Dr. Trealease would have been there with many of our famous friends like John Muir, where he would establish a relationship with him. He would continue on through the course of his life. He would also get to know quite a few John Burroughs and other people who would write about this experience. And so he was very much involved in what was going on in the scientific world at large. He also made quite a bit of headway in understanding more about the Azores, which is an island chain off the coast of Portugal. The Azores is a very interesting field of study because much like the work that Charles Darwin was doing, identifying how genetic species can vary in an island system, Dr. Trealease was doing something similar in relationship to plants. And so he was trying to identify how genetic mutation worked or was different in relationship to island chains. We're learning more about that because we still do work in that area and on a similar project today, and that we still are using DNA technology now to understand how genetic variations work in different places like that. In the course of Dr. Trealease's life, he is most well known for his function as a scientific namer. He would name over 2,500 species of plants in the course of his life. This is a long process that requires a lot of research and really formalizes how an herbarium functions. And at that time, I just learned the other day from one of our herbarium assistants that our herbarium before Dr. Trealease were just samples in between newspaper that were stacked up. And Dr. Trealease instituted the paper naming system. So taking those samples, putting them and attaching them to paper, and then writing the detailed information that we now use as research tools. I will add the caveat before I carry on that all this and more will come to you via an interpretive plan in your email box that you will receive after this presentation in the next week or two. I know that's a very quick overview, but the interpretive plan is about 15 or 20 pages and too long to print en masse. So I want to make sure you all have a copy of that digitally. We will print some and leave them in the Ridgeway volunteer office if you have interest and want to learn more in a narrative way. So don't think I'm cheating you out of all of the juicy details. I did want to share a little bit about the renovation work because we're probably getting an equal amount of questions to the narrative as we are about the work that we as the garden did. As many of you may know, the rooms prior to this renovation work in the East Wing were completely untouched. There was wallpaper from many, many moons ago that was hanging off the walls in some places. It had been used as a storage space, so we had chandeliers and artwork and furniture just sitting in these rooms. They were locked. Visitors and staff at large did not see what was in these rooms, and they had not been updated for many years. You can see here we had quite a bit of floor to fill in, as well as quite a bit of painting. The windows, etc., had never been updated or repainted, so to speak, probably in 10 plus years. We also had doorways and other things that needed some cleaning and some love, as well as preparing the walls for our final intended outcome, which would be wallpaper. The process of hanging wallpaper is a very complicated one in that you can't just paint the wall. It requires plaster. We had many other cracks and stuff from settling over time to fill and to ensure the house was in a sturdy form to put that wallpaper up. Wallpaper decisions were our biggest challenge and something we're getting the most questions about these days because our visitors can see that there is such an obvious visual change. We make decisions in a variety of ways. Firstly, this paper is much different than choosing paper for your home in that because our main goal is to educate people through exhibit narrative, the wallpaper must be a canvas for signage. So it has to be something that isn't going to distract from the ability for people to read it. That means a lot of the patterns that were popular in 1900 were kind of out because some of them are a bit too distracting for the visitors to engage with. We also wanted a period appropriate paper, of course. However, the furniture that you'll see in these rooms is largely 1860 to 1880s time period. We use this furniture because beyond having it in our collection already, it's unlikely that the Trealease family went out and bought brand new trendy furniture to go into their home. They would have been using likely what someone would have offered previously or something they would have bought 10 or 20 years ago, just like the rest of us. And so finding paper that matches that style of furniture was also a priority. We also have an entire west wing of the house that has wallpaper in it. This means we already have a style guide, we already have a color theme that I wanted to ensure that the paper fit into, because there are times where you're looking from east to west or west to east, and you want to make sure that that color aesthetic is close. More importantly, we're also a botanical institution, so we wanted to have paper that represented our love of plants, and so finding papers that were appropriate. At this moment, I'm actually working with someone from our research department to identify what plants might have been the inspiration for this paper. At this moment, many of these papers are arbitrarily named because they're artistic renderings of plants. So they may not be an exact species of plant, but I want to know as close as possible to what those might be. And you'll see those in the form of a plant profile when that information becomes available and put together. So after I ordered some samples, a fair variety of samples, I gathered a team of interested parties who were helping us make decisions. People like our friend Neshka Pfeiffer over at the museum, friends from communications who do our signage and are interested in color schemes in our presentation, our archivist Andy Colligan, people of those nature, as well as myself and Jen Wolf on the interpretation team, and our installers like Kevin Mattingly. So all those people came together, we narrowed it down, and then Jen Wolf and I took all these samples and put them all together to see which fit together. It was a long and tedious process. You don't really know what something's going to look like until you see it on the wall, but we're very pleased with the appearance. I'm really enjoying seeing the visitor reaction because it does give a much different feel to the space. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that all with you if you have the ability to walk out with me after I am done chatting away here. As I mentioned, this furniture has been a part of our collection probably about 1960s, 1970s. They were donated. That was a very common time for historical institutions across the country to get grandma's attic full of furniture donated. And so both of these beds were donated by interested parties. These are both beds that are in the Rococo Revival style and kind of reflect a lot of what you see on Henry Shaw's side of the house. I'm very excited right now because I'm working with our colleagues in horticulture to identify the type of wood that a lot of our furniture is made from. And so we'll be hopefully doing some programming here in the future about how this furniture was made. And more about the pieces themselves, because the craftsmanship that goes into a lot of these pieces are what give our visitors that wow factor. They don't make them like they used to, is a true saying when it comes to a lot of this furniture. We also share quite a bit about the Rococo style in these rooms, so many of our visitors want to know more about this furniture. It's interesting, this piece that's in the children's bedroom is marked by the maker. So I did a maker profile that hangs on the wall to share more about Alexander Rue and his shop in New York that would have made this furniture and what that process would look like. So we're also doing our diligence to share what the details are that tell the stories. My goal is that every object that's on display is an opportunity for one of our staff or volunteers to tell a story that connects to a person. As you all know, our visitors want to know about a variety of things. You never know what someone's going to ask you about. And so I'm trying to do my diligence to balance all those antique lovers with the narrative and the importance of the place with regard to the history of the garden. We also did quite a bit with interpretive messaging. If you've been to the house, you'll see that there is signage on the wall, which is a little bit different than some of our other spaces. So in a more traditional exhibit style, there are panels that allow for a self-guided experience if a volunteer or other interpreter is not available. Hopefully these are also an opportunity for a jumping off point. They're only what is it, maybe 100 words at times. And so they're just little snippets that are hopefully sparking the interest of a visitor that are giving you an opportunity to learn more. The interpretation department has done research in the past year, as I mentioned, with that interpretive plan, to give you, the volunteers and staff, as much information as possible to share with our visitors. We want you to feel like you know as much as you can to answer those tough questions as they come at you. It is also important to mention that this exhibit will hopefully change every year. Again, this is our introduction to who the Trealease family are. We want our visitors to get to know them, and as you saw this quick key theme overview, we have lots of things to share with them. We have lots of directions we can go in more detail in the coming years to share different narratives and keep people wanting to come back and learn more. I also thought it was a good time to mention that there's been a little bit of a change in operation in the house, and that now we have volunteers stationed all over the house in certain areas. So if you come in for a tour or bring a group of school children, just know that there will be a staff person at the door kind of directing traffic, and that you'll find volunteers all over the house. We're still happy to take over if you want to pass your group off, but we're also happy to have you leading tours throughout the house. That's completely up to you, and we want you to feel as comfortable as possible with the material to do what you would like with it. Other than that, I'm very thankful to be able to share this with you. We're very fortunate to have an opportunity to share a story that's a bit more personally connected to some of the experiences that people in today's world are still having. With that, who wants to take a walk?